For years, the conversation around Nigerian women in leadership has focused narrowly on political office, but a quieter exclusion is happening in sectors that actually drive economic growth. Walk into any top-tier bank or boardroom, engineering firm or tech startup. The absence of women at senior levels tells a story that we have refused to read. Now, the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap report consistently ranks Nigeria poorly on economic participation. Now, women dominate the informal economy, but remain absent from formal, high-value sectors like finance, tech, oil and gas, and manufacturing. This isn't a talent deficit. Nigeria produces brilliant female professionals every year. The deficit, however, is structural. 3 things hold women back: access to capital, networks, and mentorship. Female-led businesses receive a fraction of venture capital that male ones do, and this concept of old boys networks perpetuate themselves quietly. Meanwhile, unpaid domestic work still disproportionately caps how far women can go. Now, the program manager and Legislative and Gender Policy and Legal Advocacy Center, Nkiru Uzodi, joins us now for a discussion on how to get more Nigerian women involved in key sectors beyond politics and why women are marginally represented. Good afternoon and welcome to Newsday.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me, and happy International Women's Day.
Yes, absolutely. Happy International Women's Day. And I think, I'll just start by asking you, I kind of listed out some of the reasons why you don't see as many women in these boardrooms and in these specific industries. But if you could say what the number one reason is for why there isn't more representation of women, especially in Nigeria, in these kinds of fields, what's behind that? Is it education or is it something else?
I think it's different things. Education is one, but I also think our socialization is a key factor and a key reason for women not being represented. I think, women, have to be socialized early. We have to start by telling young girls and young women that they belong in spaces where decisions are being made. So if that socialization is not starting early, if it's not happening in schools, if it's not happening in universities, then it's not unusual to see some kind of, aversion or to see very few women going into those spaces. But I would say that in terms of women participation, I think it's worse when it comes to politics, governance, and leadership. When it comes to the corporate sector or the private sector, I believe women are doing better. Of course, the numbers are not where we want them to be, but these gaps and these challenges are actually worse when it comes to governance and politics.
And that's right. So the question now is, how can we shift the mentality? How do we shift some kind of national conversation so that women's inclusion is seen as more of a hard economic necessity rather than, just doing women and the female gender favor in general, and to check the boxes on gender parity? How do we get that discussion to start happening?
I think what we're doing now is one way, which is talking about it, creating awareness. I like the opening of the segment. You share data and statistics, of how women are faring in different sectors. I think it's very important for people to understand the problem, because we can't begin to talk about solutions if people actually don't understand what the problem is and they don't understand how bad it is or how abysmal the statistics are. So for the sector where I work, I work in civil society, and my organization will do a lot of work with the legislature. One of the ways that we feel, we can advance this conversation is to get more women in leadership. So currently, we're working with the National Assembly to push for the Special Seats Bill, which is a bill to ensure that more women are in the National Assembly. And the whole idea is to ensure that the legislature is representative, that it's more inclusive, and women are there where decisions are made. Because at the end of the day, the legislature is where, should I say, decisions about public funds are made, about resourcing. So you find out a lot of the gaps that you see, in other sectors. A lot of it comes from inadequate government resourcing or prioritization of women's needs. So my belief is if you have women in positions of decision making, where they can influence government policies, where they can influence the actions of the larger society, and even if it means just, showing presence and telling other young women, I can be there and I can aspire to leadership. I think that's very, very, it's a big thing, and it can go a very long way in correcting some of these challenges that you have mentioned.
And, if we're to stay on that topic of the special seats bill, it's a temporary amendment, so it would only last for 4 election cycles. Do you think that's enough time to fundamentally change, the makeup of the gender inequality in Nigerian politics? And do you feel like that political will is actually there?
Okay, first of all, in terms of fundamentally changing, I think it's a very good first step. In fact, it's an important first step, because since 2007, with each election cycle, we've seen fewer women win elections or come into elected positions. It's dropping, and the predictions are that with 2027, it's actually going to get worse. So what we see is that this is a very important complementary measure, of course, to other actions being taken, for instance, mentorship, education, and the rest of it. So I think it's going to bring about a shift, and it's going to be a kind of catalyst, to even more inclusion. Now, on whether the political will is there, I think currently, at least with this current assembly, it's improved, compared to what we saw with the previous assembly or the previous administration. So the momentum right now is stronger. You have more people talking about it, and and our belief and our hope, those of us who are advocates in this civic space, is that momentum will translate into very significant and concrete gains.
And even pushing it a bit further, do you think the Nigerian government should introduce some kind of mandatory gender quotas for jobs, for boards of publicly listed companies, which is the way some European models do it, rather than relying on voluntary corporate governance codes? This is separate from governance.
I think that could work. Anything to get more women in the door. But the thing is, I believe with Nigeria, there's still there's serious resistance to these measures. We're talking about more women in the National Assembly, and there's still some resistance to that. If the government has the political will to do that, I think that should be encouraged. And I have to say that we don't actually need a law per se. The government doesn't necessarily need a law to actually take gender-sensitive actions. There's a national gender policy. Each administration can make a decision to take specific actions to advance women. And I think that is what the theme of this year's International Women's Day is all about. It talks about give to gain, giving women opportunities, giving them the trust and the space to lead. And it also talks about, rights, justice, and action. So that action can be legal or constitutional, which is what we are pursuing on one hand. And on the other hand, that action can also be just, decisions or policies that the executive or the government can make to improve women's leadership.
But just very quickly, I think we're running out of time. You said something interesting, that since 2014, there have progressively been less and less women in politics, and you're expecting, less in 2027. I'm wondering if you can kind of summarize why you think that is, especially in the context as we've been taking a lot of stories around, just violence in the lead up to elections and, voting. Just why do you think we're seeing less women in politics, and does the violence around Nigerian politics have anything to do with that?
Definitely. Violence is one of it. intimidation, there are reputational costs to running, if you're a woman, serious reputational costs. But there's also the issue of money, which is a very, very big and often unaddressed issue. We've seen the recent Electoral Act amendments where the threshold for campaigning, the financial limits for campaign funds have been increased. All that is going to have implications. You really need money. You need a war chest, basically, to run elections in this country. And a lot of women do not have they don't have that kind of money to run elections. So I think money is a big factor. Then, of course, there's the cultural stereotypes, which cannot change overnight. And that is why we propose, legal and constitutional measures, because there are certain barriers that are going to take a long time to overcome. Of course, if you also bring in political parties, gatekeeping, and the unfair and skewed system for nominating candidates, all that is not going to end overnight. It's going to take a while, and those are some of the reasons why the numbers have dropped since 2007. But I strongly believe that with a legal or constitutional measure, we can begin to reverse that trend.
We surely and sincerely hope the same. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for your insights. Nkiru Uzodi, the program manager of the Legislative Gender Policy and Legal Advocacy Center.